What are cultural and political ecologies? So, cultural ecology, to begin with, is a post war theory within environmental anthropology. It's a theory that explains this adaptive relationship between human learned subsistence behavior on the one hand and the environment on the other. Within cultural ecology, anthropologists will use ethnography, a kind of research method that's based on long-term qualitative research, usually 1 year, and involves participant observation, so living with a group of people, not just being a detached observer, but really getting involved in people's life, using this method to explain human behavior in context, as well as patterns then between the behavior we see in one environmental context and the behavior that we see in another environmental context. A kind of comparative work that gets done after ethnographic research is completed. In contrast, political ecologists use the same research methods of ethnography to really centralize politics, power, and inequality in the relationship between behavior and the environment. Political ecologists, unlike cultural ecologists, are interested in the ways that economics and politics shape the environment and how the environment in turn shapes them, how the environment in turn shapes economics and politics. In classical cultural ecology, the work by people like Julian Stewart and Marvin Harris, for example, human culture or learned behavior adapts to and interacts with environments over time, as well as evolves in responses to the constraints and opportunities that environments provide. For classical cultural ecologists, the key to understanding culture is in economic and environmental factors, primarily because human behavior is an adaptive response to the environment. So for classical cultural ecologists, describing different cultures, what type of subsistence economy they have, and then explaining them right within this adaptive and evolutionary framework is a central objective. For example, subsistence strategies are an essential part of cultural ecological research, understanding how a human population achieves its basic needs. Now, for 99% of human evolution, humans have been living with a foraging mode of production, a foraging subsistence strategy. It's incredible to think that before the development of other subsistence strategies, that all humans would have been foragers, and in fact, the human population would have been very small. So if we go to about 15,000 years before the present, the human population over the entirety of the Earth was only 10 million people, so smaller than one of the major metropolises in the world today. This strategy, in fact, is what strategy for subsistence that humans share really with many other different animals, collecting various resources such as vegetation, other animals, and fish. In fact, 75% of the resources that are collected by foragers are primary producers or plants. So 99% of human evolution, and for foraging peoples today, the overwhelming resource that's utilized is vegetables, right? Vegetation, plant material. And what we see is for this particular foraging strategy, it leads to a kind of behavior and a kind of human population. Very low population densities. We see that foragers tend to be egalitarian. They don't have a lot of differences in status and power across different people within the community. They tend to exist in a band level organization, which is kind of a loose affiliation of individuals. And they tend to have an animistic worldview. That is, the natural world is also a spiritual world, that it's animated by many different forces, powers, spirits, and so on. So for environmental anthropologists, and particularly those classical cultural anthropologists, they like to bring ethnographic research, right, to different foraging communities. For example, if you're interested in learning more about foragers, you could read the work of the anthropologist Colin Turnbull and his work with the Mbuti people in Central Africa to understand how Mbuti foragers subsist, right? They want to understand the way the Mbuti move through their territory, this Inuri forest, how they use the forest resources for food and other materials. Classical cultural ecologists are interested in the decision-making they make. So classical cultural ecologists have developed ideas about the optimal foraging decision-making, that when you start trying to understand their movements, it's based on an analysis of where resources are, so that the groups can be seen moving to areas with the highest concentration of nutrient-rich foods. They will remain there until there's not the same rate of return, right? As they begin to see diminishing yields in one location, they then move to a new patch of resources, which again, they will stop until there is no longer a same rate of return. You can imagine the incredible and intricate indigenous knowledge that people like the Mbuti have of the Inuri forest environment. But as we've described, if we think about human life today, whereas all humans practice foraging in the past, in the evolutionary past, if you will, it isn't the case that the predominant or majority of humans are foragers today. In fact, only 1% of the population on the earth today continues a foraging subsistence strategy. And so cultural ecologists have developed a typology of the different subsistence strategies that humans through time and throughout the world today subsist and interact, right, with their environment. And so we can add horticulture as an important human subsistence strategy. Horticulture developed around 15,000 years before present and really is crucially important in human evolution because it reflects a shift from a collecting strategy where humans collect the resources and materials they need from their immediate environment to a productive strategy, the use of domesticated plants, and this kind of supplementing the resources that are obtained through basic kind of foraging. We can talk about, for horticulture, a predominant Swidden or forest farming model. So in this model, humans will clear a patch of the forest. They will burn the vegetation, immediately transforming the vegetation into nutrients that move into the soil rapidly. That involves planting, usually for one particular year. And after a harvest is collected, that particular cleared plot will be allowed to fallow, often for more than a decade. It can be up to 15 years. In this system, the Swidden or forest farming model of horticulture, human populations will also move. So often they will have a series of plots in the forest that they rotate around through time. Now, this horticulture system is a productive economy, but its production is quite low. The technology that is utilized is very simple. So we see the use of fire, things like digging sticks for planting, but there is no weeding, there's no inputs like herbicides that are utilized. In fact, there is no irrigation. And so with the amount of weeds and with very little water, just dependent on natural precipitation, the yields tend to be quite low in a horticultural system, even if there is a small surplus. And the surplus is quite important. So for foraging, there is no surplus because there is no production. A human population will only collect the resources that are immediately needed. But with horticulture, there is this extra yield that is collected. And what it does, having an extra yield, having a surplus, allows for a more sedentary lifestyle. It allows for growth of the population. It leads to a more complex division of labor between people. The people who are, let's say, involved with clearing or burning, those who are involved with planting versus harvesting, those who continue to hunt or gather materials. This division of labor is very important because we begin to see differences in distribution, right, of yields, and particularly of the surplus. We begin to have populations that vie for control over particular territories, and we begin to see the development of warfare for the protection of those territories. And again, classical cultural ecologists will use ethnography to try to understand horticultural societies. If you're interested in this, I highly recommend the work of Roy Rappaport in Papua New Guinea. Roy Rappaport described a horticultural culture, the Tsambaga, that was based primarily on the growth of tubers like sweet potatoes, yams, taro, and the development of pig husbandry. Rappaport describes a sustainability problem. Because of the increase of population and the productive nature of the economy, both the human population as well as the pig herds increase through time, and they begin to outpace the local carrying capacity of the environment. That is, what the environment can support in terms of providing resources to humans or providing resources to pigs, that it will outpace that every 100 years. Ingeniously, the Tsambaga, this horticulturalist culture, developed what they call a kaiko ceremony. So roughly every 15 years, the Tsambaga hold a kaiko ceremony, and they slaughter pigs in mass. When the number of pigs become difficult to manage, when they begin to have signs, right, of increasing over a particular kind of threshold, villagers slaughter the pigs in mass. They have a huge feast. They invite neighboring tribal groups, and after the feast is initiated, warfare begins at the boundaries of their territory. Through the kaiko ceremony, both the pig populations as well as the human populations are reduced, bringing them back within a key threshold or carrying capacity, an ingeniously adaptive form of human culture and behavior. So we've been talking about classical cultural ecology, but classical cultural ecology is old-fashioned today. In fact, there's very few true cultural ecologists that are working in anthropology today. And you can think about the way theory kind of develops and becomes elaborated through time. And so cultural ecology sort of becomes replaced by political ecology in our field. So political ecologists were critical of cultural ecology. They argued that the role of power in the use of environmental resources was undeveloped within cultural ecology. And they bring a kind of political economic perspective on it in the environment and environmental injustice. So there's this same interest in the relation of culture and the environment, behavior and the environment, but political ecologists will magnify the issue of power because it is argued to be within the theory central in understanding that behavior-environment relationship. In fact, political ecologists, while they will conduct scientific research, ethnographic research, and so on, they're also very interested in things like policy and advocacy, that it's not enough just to observe and try to describe and explain humans' relationships to the environment. But because of the role of power and because of issues such as environmental injustice, that increasingly scientific research is inadequate to tackle the problems that we are facing today. And so they move towards political activism. They move towards an attempt to intervene and change the nature of history when we're thinking about the range of subsistence strategies that humans utilize. For example, we could think about the political ecology of Mbuti foraging. So when we talked about the Mbuti foragers, we described them in a kind of isolated and ahistorical manner. We described them in sort of this timeless way of how they interacted with their environment. But in fact, Mbuti foragers in this day and age are faced with many, many different political problems that are affecting their use of the environment. There's things like land encroachment from other groups. There's deforestation. That's the result of other groups logging their forest resources, mining subsurface resources within their environment, expanding agriculture into traditional forested regions of their territory. All of these make the question of sustainability in the future of Mbuti foraging questions. It's not a given that this subsistence strategy will continue in the future. And so there's this issue that we discussed of political ecologists wanting to bring power right to the center of the discussion. Political economy and environmental justice, things like advocacy. So for Mbuti people, discrimination and things like basic land and human rights are central issues today. Armed conflict between groups and the state threaten Mbuti people. So political ecologists, while they're interested in the Mbuti's relationship to the environment, they come at it from a slightly different academic perspective. Likewise, we could think about the political ecology of Guinean horticulture. Just like thinking about different culturally diverse foragers, when we think about horticulturalists, and then specifically those in the Ghanaian area, they are subject to government development policies today. So they are not timeless, they are not stagnant, they are interacting with other groups, and their culture is undergoing rapid change. You have infrastructure development that is meant to bring the market to horticulturalists. The government is also pushing global market integration. So as you see in the image, coffee production is being pushed as a way to bring these horticulturalists into a modern and capitalist present. And this is in many ways undermining traditional horticulture in the New Ghanaian region. So a political ecologist, while they celebrate the adaptive nature of traditional Ghanaian horticulture, they also recognize today the role of power and politics in undermining this sustainable subsistence strategy, and they're interested in analyzing, right, the political economic dynamics by which it's occurring. In conclusion, we've been talking about the cultural and political ecology theories. Cultural ecology, a kind of classic perspective on adaptation and human subsistence. We talked about some of the classic examples of foraging and horticultural cultures, subsistence strategies, right? Or modes of production is found in Central Africa and Oceania. And then we ended really thinking about political ecology and its perspective on things like those foraging and horticultural cultures, emphasizing the role of power, inequality, and injustice, right? When we start thinking about economic and environmental issues.